Some cases aren't mysteries in the traditional sense, with a crime scene and an investigation into the events of what happened. Sometimes criminal cases are on the record, and the question isn't what happened, but how it was allowed to happen at all. Every warning existed ahead of time, risks were documented, but the outcome still unfolded exactly as people said it would.
This isn't a story about sudden tragedy or a freak accident. This is about a child whose life depended on routine, training, and specific care protocols, and a system that was supposed to protect that child, and instead treated him like a procedure.
From early childhood, this beautiful boy lived with a rare condition with no cure and no recovery, and his survival depended on continuity from a caregiver who knew what they were doing. And for years, that child received that kind of care. But as family strain grew, what followed was a series of choices made in spite of what was already known, creating consequences that were catastrophic. This episode contains discussion of severe childhood illness and death. Listener discretion is strongly advised. This is the story of Ryder Belisle. I'm Ashley.
And I'm Ricky.
And this is Crime Salad. There's a place called Sedro-Woolley, Washington, and it sits quietly in Skagit County, tucked between farmland, forest, and river valleys. It's known for its small town roots and proximity to the Skagit River, so it's a place that's built around community and peaceful living. With a history of logging and agriculture, the streets are quiet and the neighborhoods are modest. In late fall and winter, the weather here turns unmistakably Pacific Northwest. Days are short, rain is constant, sometimes light and misty, sometimes steady enough to keep people indoors for days at a time. So, for a family surrounded by complex medical risks, traveling was hard, emergency response was slower, and the margin for error shrunk. For Tachi Lin, who had her own prolonged experience with medical complications, all she wanted was the chance at a better life for her children, specifically her son Ryder. From the very beginning, Ryder's life was shaped by medicine. He was born prematurely in 2013, and almost immediately, it was clear that something wasn't right. As he grew, delays became harder to explain away, and typical answers from doctors about his condition stopped making sense. After years of testing, appointments, and advocacy, doctors finally reached a devastating diagnosis. Ryder Belisle had Sanfilippo syndrome type 3B, a rare, fatal, neurodegenerative disorder.
Sanfilippo is often described as having childhood dementia. Kids slowly lose the skill they once had, like speech, movement, swallowing, and the ability to breathe on their own. There's no cure or treatment that stops the progression. The only thing you can do is manage comfort, safety, and quality of life.
As Ryder's condition became clearer, so did his needs. He required ongoing neurological oversight, specialized therapies, and eventually feeding tube management and respiratory support. His care was continuous and exact, and very early on, Ryder's mother assumed the role of his primary medical caregiver and coordinator. She scheduled appointments, managed therapies, learned the equipment, and became fluent in the warning signs that could indicate emergencies. As the years went on, Ryder's condition progressed exactly as doctors had warned it would. He continued to receive therapies and specialized medical care, and nearly all of it was coordinated through his mother, Tachi. His condition caused severe neurological impairment, progressive loss of motor function, seizures, chronic aspiration risk, and ongoing respiratory compromise. Over time, Ryder became nonverbal and lost his hearing and vision. He was quadriplegic, dependent on a feeding tube for nutrition, and he required nighttime BiPAP support to help him breathe.
BiPAP stands for bilevel positive airway pressure. It's a non-invasive form of respiratory support that helps someone breathe when their body can no longer do so reliably on its own. It's a little different from a standard oxygen mask because it doesn't just deliver air, but it actively assists breathing. It provides two levels of support, which is a higher one when the person inhales and a lower one when they exhale. So that reduces the effort it takes to breathe and help keep the airway open.
Right. So as far as we can understand, Ryder, he used a BiPAP at night because his neurological disease impaired his ability to protect his airway and regulate breathing while he was sleeping. So without that support, he was at risk of hypoventilation, which means not breathing deeply or frequently enough, which could lead to dangerous drops in oxygen or a buildup in carbon dioxide. This is important for later. What you'll also hear us talk about a little more later is aspiration, which is when foreign substances enter the lungs. BiPAP also prevents aspiration by supporting breathing and keeping the airway more stable. So it reduces the chance that secretions, vomit, or feeding contents can enter the lungs. Another important thing to know that BiPAP has been used alongside careful positioning, regular suctioning, close monitoring, and immediate response if something does go wrong. So if a person vomits while on a BiPAP and isn't positioned or monitored correctly, the risk of aspiration can increase. So every aspect of Ryder's survival depended on precise, uninterrupted, round-the-clock care. Appointments, treatment plans, equipment management, and daily care routines were what ruled Tachi's life, because she would do anything to give her son the life he deserved. And because of that, Ryder survived far beyond early prognoses.
And Tachi became a very well-known advocate because of this. Tachi is actually deaf, and she's built a large following online of more than 3 million followers across TikTok, Facebook, and other social media platforms, which I'm sure have grown since Ryder's story has become more public.
She first drew attention by sharing her family's life in real time after the grief of losing her daughter to a rare disease, as well as the daily realities of caregiving, sign language as a deaf person, and the relentless uncertainty that comes up with medical complications. And over time, that platform became a window into her fight with Ryder's Sanfilippo syndrome. So for millions of people watching Tachi, she wasn't just another influencer, but a mother who was documenting her survival through advocacy and adapting to loving children whose lives were threatened by medical uncertainty.
But while Ryder's needs continued and as the family welcomed more children, the family dynamic began to break down as conflict between Tachi and Ryder's father began to escalate. And eventually, Tachi found herself being a single mother. Now, there's not much information online about what exactly happened between them, but you can make some guesses based on some of the information we have about Russell, Tachi's ex-husband, later.
Tachi was interviewed by activists for Sanfilippo syndrome to discuss Ryder's story, and she said that she always knew something wasn't right. At first, Ryder had been diagnosed with autism, but for Tachi, that explanation never fully fit. The changes that she was seeing felt much deeper than an autism explanation. So for nearly 2 years, she kept searching for answers. Eventually, Tachi traveled from her home in Sedro-Woolley, Washington, to Tacoma to see a doctor who would take a closer look.
According to Tachi, the doctor looked at Ryder and immediately recognized what others had missed. That's when Ryder was diagnosed with Sanfilippo syndrome, which affects only 1 in every 200,000 children.
And Tachi later said that while it was a relief to finally understand what was happening, it was immediately followed by the realization that her child was not going to live a full life. Doctors explained that as the disease progressed, Ryder's brain would gradually lose the skills it had already developed. He would eventually forget how to walk, how to swallow, and in time, how to breathe. Doctors warned that symptoms could accelerate quickly, sometimes over weeks instead of years. So at just 3 years old, Ryder was already facing a future measured in milestones lost. Doctors told Tachi that Ryder might not live to see his 16th birthday. But instead of pulling away, she leaned in. Tachi began holding fundraisers and events to raise awareness about Sanfilippo syndrome for Ryder and for other children facing the same diagnosis. She had the words, "never giving up," tattooed on her arm, something she said felt as permanent as the love she had for her son.
So over time, Ryder went from energetic and constantly on the move to becoming non-mobile. He went from eating large meals to relying on a feeding pump. His younger sister, Tessa, who was just 11 months younger, began passing him in milestones, becoming in many ways his big sister. And I just can't imagine what that's like to watch this happen to your own kid.
Tachi shifted her focus from trying to save Ryder's life to supporting the life he still had by making him comfortable and making sure he felt loved and meaningful. Even though it was hard, she kept showing up. She pushed Ryder's wheelchair wherever she needed to go to support her daughters, making sure that they knew that their mom would always support them. Tachi also leaned on family support when she could. Her parents helped her juggle therapy schedules and appointments, especially during the pandemic. Telehealth and delivery services, it became crucial for them. And while Tachi's circle grew smaller, she stayed connected to the San Filippo community so she could learn, advocate, and witness both the beauty and the heartbreak of battling this disease. So by late 2024, the realities of Ryder's connection were becoming harder to manage. As his disease progressed, so did the complexity of his care. Appointments became more frequent, and emergencies were more dangerous. And travel itself became a medical calculation every time Ryder left the house.
Sedro-Woolley is a small town, and specialized pediatric care is not close by. Years earlier, when Tachi was searching for answers, she had driven more than an hour south to Tacoma just to find a doctor who would listen, because that level of specialty simply didn't exist near their home. So as Ryder's condition advanced, the distance became more than just an inconvenience. Every appointment meant a long drive. Every emergency meant calculating whether Ryder could safely endure travel at all. What once felt manageable became increasingly risky as his body became more fragile.
Exactly. So naturally, Ryder's mother began researching relocation options with those realities in mind. And her focus centered on closer proximity to specialized care, reduced travel, burden for Ryder, and improved caregiver and support services that could realistically meet his needs. And that's when Ohio emerged as a viable option. Specialists were closer, support services were more concentrated, and critically, the physical strain of transporting Ryder along with all of his medical equipment would be a lot easier. Summit County in northeastern Ohio was anchored by Akron and surrounding major medical infrastructure. Within minutes of their new home would be a pediatric specialist, hospital systems experienced in complex neurological and respiratory care, and in-home support services that were equipped to handle children with advanced medical needs. Ryder's care team, therapies, and emergency resources would no longer be calculated by long distance.
In Skagit County, Washington, specialized pediatric services were limited. Many of Ryder's providers were more than an hour away, and care was fragmented across locations. Emergency travel meant long drives on rural highways, which was dangerous as Ryder's condition progressed. So this wasn't just a split decision based on preference. This was a calculated decision for Ryder's needs.
Right, and this need became a lot more serious when, in late spring of 2025, Ryder's condition took a sudden and dangerous turn. He developed a severe respiratory illness that quickly overwhelmed his already fragile system. And this resulted in a prolonged medical emergency where Ryder was admitted to the ICU, and he remained there for nearly 30 days. He suffered multiple respiratory failures, episodes where his body could no longer maintain breathing on its own. It was an extremely scary situation. And throughout this hospitalization, Tachi remained Ryder's primary caregiver. She was constantly at his bedside while managing communication with doctors, monitoring his changes, and helping navigate the complexities of his care. This hospitalization severely elevated Ryder's medical risk. So stability became the priority for Tachi, like it would for any competent mother.
But it seemed like that same priority didn't really come through for Russell, Ryder's father. It was in the immediate aftermath of this that the legal conflict between Tachi and Ryder's father escalated. Because in June of 2025, Ryder's mother filed a formal notice of intent to relocate. The stated reasons were proximity to specialized medical care, reduced travel burden, and stronger caregiver support, all of which were factors that directly affected Ryder's safety and quality of life.
And Tachi followed Washington state law to the letter. She formally filed a notice of intent to relocate, notifying Russell that she planned to move the children from Skagit County to Akron, Ohio, so that Ryder could access specialized medical care closer to home, which was in her right as the custodial parent. Under Washington law, Russell had 30 days to object to the relocation, but he did not file an objection. So logically, once the statutory objection period passed without response, Tachi proceeded with the move. She relocated with the children to Ohio, continuing Ryder's medical care without interruption and placing him closer to the specialists and the support services that his condition required.
But amazingly, Ryder's father sought custody through the courts after Tachi moved Ryder and his two sisters from Washington state to Ohio, even though he had missed the 30-day objection period. And for some strange reason, the Washington custody court was willing to hear Russell's case.
Yes, and that was scary for Tachi because she believed her ex-husband was not simply a concerned parent raising objections. Russell had documented criminal history with court records showing him as a convicted felon, found guilty of kidnapping a minor and assault with a deadly weapon. She didn't think that Russell would care for her children properly. But in Skagit County, Haley W. Sebens, she presided over a hearing where Tachi was permitted to appear by Zoom during that hearing. And Tachi said that she was explicitly barred from presenting evidence related to abuse allegations or Ryder's medical needs. She was limited to discussing procedural and legal matters only. So the court considered changing custody without hearing the very information meant to protect this child. The outcome of that proceeding was a written order granting the father custody of all three children, including a medically fragile nonverbal child whose care was dependent on specialized training and equipment.
And they made that decision with no testimony taken on Ryder's medical needs, no findings addressing the prior reports of violence, and no explanation was offered for how the children's safety would be endured. To me, that sounds less like due process and more like chaos.
And that's what Tachi said. She described the experience as a family court circus. After securing the Washington custody order, Russell and his legal team turned their attention to Ohio. He filed a habeas corpus petition in an Ohio court asking authorities to immediately take physical custody of the children and return them to him. In practical terms, the petition sought emergency enforcement before Ohio courts had fully evaluated jurisdiction, medical risk, or the circumstances of the relocation, which is exactly where these things got complicated. Because under the Uniform Child Custody Jurisdiction and Enforcement Act, jurisdiction remains with the original state while a custody case is still active, especially when a relocation has only recently occurred. And at this point, Ohio was not yet the child's home state.
Well, let's explain this a little. When people hear custody was signed over, they assume the case is finished. But in family court, a custody order does not mean the case is closed. In Washington, the custody case was still active. There were unresolved motions, ongoing disputes, and no final judgment closing the case. And that matters because jurisdiction stays with the original court until the case is formally finished or transferred.
Which is exactly where Uniform Child Custody Jurisdiction and Enforcement Act comes in. It prevents exactly this kind of chaos. Parents dragging children across state lines and forcing new courts to relitigate custody. Under that law, the original state keeps jurisdiction while the case is ongoing. A new state does not become the home state until the children have lived there long enough, usually 6 months, and emergency enforcement is supposed to be limited, especially when there are safety or medical concerns. So Ohio was not supposed to decide custody. Its role was limited to cautiously determining whether an existing order should be enforced. Russell's habeas corpus request was not asking Ohio to review the full situation. Instead, it sought immediate action before questions of jurisdiction, medical risk, or due process had been addressed. Tachi's filings emphasized that the Washington case was still active. The relocation had not been lawfully challenged, and Ohio had not yet become the children's home state.
So basically, it was overlapping authority and capitalizing on unresolved issues, and compelled the court to act faster than the safeguards were designed to allow.
Right, because during that time, temporary motions were filed and ex parte requests were made, which means Tachi was actively trying to slow things down. An ex parte motion is when one parent asks the judge for help without waiting for the other parent to be present. And this could happen when they believe something urgent or dangerous is happening. And one of those things was Tachi's own fear of her ex-husband. Tachi appeared before Judge Sebin's ex parte, which was meant to give her a chance to speak freely about abuse without fear, pressure, or intimidation. And she wanted an emergency protection order against Russell, as she feared for her safety and the safety of her children. Well, Washington law explicitly allows judges to issue temporary protection orders without notifying the other party first for this exact reason. But apparently, that's not how the hearing played out. According to Tachi's account in court filings, the attorney representing Russell appeared at the hearing anyway, despite the fact that it was scheduled as ex parte and without having a filed formal notice to participate. Under Washington law, Russell's attorney had no standing to participate in that hearing because the matter was scheduled as ex parte. He was not authorized to be present, to speak, or to challenge testimony.
But the judge did not remove him. Instead, she allowed him to remain in what was supposed to be a confidential, survivor-protected proceeding. In a misconduct complaint, Tachi later described that during the hearing, the attorney and the judge engaged in joking and laughter while she was attempting to present evidence of domestic violence and risk of harm. According to her account, the attorney interrupted her testimony, making the hearing no longer an emergency protection hearing, and before Tachi could even finish presenting evidence, the judge cut her off and denied the request for a temporary protection order, which to me is just insane.
It's absolutely crazy. These motions are meant to pause things, to protect a child temporarily, and give the court time to bring both sides back in for a full hearing. So Tachi was trying to get the court to listen to the fact that her son, let alone her other children, they were not going to be safe if this custody decision was enforced. But despite fear for her own safety and Ryder's recent life-threatening hospitalization, the disputes were treated primarily as a legal and procedural matter, instead of a medical risk scenario that required heightened caution. So in the weeks following Ryder's ICU hospitalization, his mother sought protection through the courts. Given his recent respiratory failures and escalating fragility, she requested protective relief orders, which was basically asking the judge to pause enforcement actions and keep the children where they were until medical risks could be properly evaluated. She wasn't trying to win custody forever. She was just trying to keep Ryder safe in the meantime.
And she wasn't making this up either. Tachi's request was based on recent documented medical events, Ryder's ICU stay, his respiratory instability, and the increased danger of travel and care disruption. She was asking the court to factor in what had just happened medically, not even hypothetical concerns. This was real stuff that just happened.
Right, and despite those concerns, enforcement actions continued. Court orders compelled the return of Tachi's children to Washington state, even though the underlying medical and safety issues remained. There was no pause or medical risk hearing or documented finding that Ryder's condition could tolerate being disrupted. A medical risk hearing is when a court pauses legal arguments and focuses on one question only. Is this child medically safe if we do what the court is being asked to do? Judges are supposed to hear directly from doctors or review medical directives. They're supposed to assess whether travel, custody transfer, or care disruption could cause harm. and they decide whether enforcement should be delayed or modified for safety. It's a safeguard to prevent legal decisions from accidentally becoming a medical emergency. So, if a child has just been in the ICU, this is where that would come into play. But for some reason, it never did.
Now, neither of us are legal experts or medical experts, but it seems like common sense that after Ryder's hospitalization, the risk profile changed dramatically, which is precisely when a medical risk hearing would normally be used to slow everything down and ask if we move forward right now, could this kill him? And it's crazy that that never happened.
But Tachi kept trying. In September of 2025, the warnings came from the state. A Washington State Developmental Disabilities case manager formally warned that Ryder's services would be terminated due to the relocation dispute. The message was that if Ryder were to return to Washington under his current condition, his medical and support services would not be immediately reestablished, which is a medical emergency waiting to happen. The case manager explained that reestablishing services could take a significant amount of time, and during that gap, Ryder could be left without essential support and services that managed feeding, positioning, respiratory risks, and daily safety. The warning also noted a shortage of in-home care providers in Skagit County, meaning that emergency stopgaps were not guaranteed. And yet enforcement continued. Despite the state's acknowledgement that Ryder could be left without essential services, there was no requirement that care be secured before any action was taken.
Also, in September of 2025, the court appointed a guardian ad litem to evaluate the situation and represent the children's best interests. The GAL conducted interviews, reviewed records, and ultimately submitted a report to the court. According to the report, the children stated that they felt safe in Ohio. Their school performance improved, and critically, Ryder was documented as receiving better access to medical care in Ohio than he would have in Washington.
This report also acknowledged uncertainty surrounding medical services in Washington, which was the same as the warnings already raised by the state disability services. The GAL report also recorded that the children expressed fear and described unsafe incidents involving their father. And despite all of that, the GAL recommended immediate enforcement. The report advised that the children be returned to Washington, that Ryder and his siblings be removed from their mother's care, and that the mother's contact be restricted to supervised visitation. These recommendations didn't resolve the medical continuity risks or address the service gaps. It just breaks my brain to try and understand how this even happened. And all of this is happening even though Russell didn't do anything about it through the normal legal channels.
Yeah, exactly. Under RCW 2609-430, a parent who intends to relocate with a child is required to give written notice to the other parent. That notice doesn't have to follow a specific format. In this case, notice of relocation was filed on May 2nd, along with documentation outlining the arrangements made in Ohio.
So, Tachi did exactly what she was supposed to do. Even better, RCW 26.09.520 establishes a presumption in favor of relocation. Under Washington law, relocation is presumed to be allowed unless the objecting parent can prove that the move would be more harmful than beneficial to the child. And that means that the burden of proof rests on the parent opposing relocation, not the parent proposing it. And here we have Tachi fighting tooth and nail to prove that the relocation is exactly what her children need. And she even fought endlessly to prove that sending them back would be dangerous, which is outside of anything she should have had to do.
Under RCW 2609-002, courts are required to prioritize the best interests of a child above all else, including safety, stability, and well-being. When a child has profound medical needs, those are not secondary considerations. The law already tells courts what to focus on: safety first, continuity of care, and minimizing risk to the child. So, in short, what the hell happened?
So in Ryder's case, his medical reality, which was dependence on a feeding tube, wheelchair use, respiratory support, and specialized care for an extremely rare disease, meant the court had a legal responsibility to weigh medical continuity and care environment above everything else. But they didn't. As fall turned into winter, the legal proceedings continued, but the focus narrowed. At times, the courts granted procedural stays or temporary pauses, but those pauses didn't end up protecting Ryder. Requests for protective relief were repeatedly denied. Enforcement actions continued moving forward, and hearing increasingly centered on compliance, contempt, and whether orders were being followed instead of whether those orders were medically safe to carry out. And at no point was an independent medical risk hearing conducted or was a child safety override applied.
On November 19, 2025, the court received a written medical directive that could not have been clearer. The directive was authored by a nuclear-qualified behavior neurologist whose evaluations are relied upon by courts and federal agencies across the county. In the directive, the neurologist stated plainly that removing Ryder from his mother's care would be life-threatening and should be avoided at all costs pending further neurological evaluation. Ryder's care environment should not be disrupted.
Exactly. The letter said that, in his words, Ryder's condition was very fragile, which he wrote in all capital letters, and it required the nearly continuous and intensive care from his mother to prevent him from dying from almost continuous seizures. They were currently awaiting advanced nuclear imaging to more accurately diagnose Ryder's current condition. In all caps, the neurologist wrote that any attempts to remove the mother from her necessary clinical care for this extremely ill child at that time would be life-threatening to the child. The doctor's letter was attached as an exhibit to the emergency motion filed before the Summit County, Ohio court. And in that filing, Ryder's condition was laid out in blunt medical terms. It described a child whose life depended on expertise and continuity. The filing stated plainly that Ryder's dependence on his mother was a matter of medical necessity. The mother was trained and experienced in these matters, and the father was not.
After all of that fighting, after every attempt Tachi made to protect herself and her family, Ohio heard the habeas corpus petition and moved to place the children in their father's custody.
Despite the explicit medical evidence submitted to the court, Judge Katrina Cook ordered Ryder to be discharged from Akron Children's Hospital and be transferred into his father's custody. At the time of this order, the court record contained no evidence that Ryder's father possessed the training, experience, or medical equipment required to safely care for a terminally ill, medically fragile child. And even worse, that decision was made without hearing from Ryder's mother. On the morning of November 19th of 2025, Tachi did not appear at the hearing because Ryder was experiencing an active seizure and required urgent medical intervention, and she notified the court of the emergency, but proceedings moved forward in her absence. What they did have was the letter from the neurologist about how even brief interruptions in Ryder's care could result in respiratory failure, aspiration, seizures, or catastrophic neurological injury. Despite the medical warnings submitted that day, custody orders issued in Washington state transferred custody of Ryder to his father, and the Ohio court enforced the Washington custody order. That same day, Ryder was discharged from the Akron Children's Hospital and transferred into his father's custody.
Tachi later stated that she attempted to intervene to prevent Ryder's removal and that she was warned of potential arrest if she interfered with enforcement of the court order, which is exactly what I would have done if someone was trying to take my child right after a medical emergency. And as predicted, Ryder's condition almost immediately deteriorated.
Throughout this period, advocates and reporting described repeated attempts by Tachi to inform the courts and medical providers that Ryder was in danger and that critical elements of his care were not being followed. By early December, Ryder showed signs of clinical decline. During a provider visit on December 3rd of 2025, notes documented increased secretions, coughing, and signs of aspiration, all of which are red flags in a child with his diagnosis. But this situation continued without intervention. On December 5th, Tachi filed an emergency motion in Ohio seeking Ryder's immediate return to hospital care. The filing attached the previously submitted medical directive, which warned that separating Ryder from his established care environment was life-threatening. The filing also referenced an allegation that one of Ryder's sisters had reported physical abuse by the father, which resulted in a report to Child Protective Services. Those allegations were included as part of the request for emergency review.
And the emergency motion did not result in an evidentiary hearing. And it wasn't acted on in time to change Ryder's care or situation, or what seemed to be an unsafe environment for his sisters as well. By the time Ryder's condition triggered emergency medical response, he was already critically ill.
Before we continue here, just a warning, because this next part is really hard to take in. It's a lot. So on the morning of December 16th of 2025, less than a month that Ryder had been in his father's care, Russell found him unresponsive and cyanotic. Cyanotic is when someone could have a bluish discoloration of the skin, and it's a result from poor circulation, oxygen of the blood. He was in cardiac arrest. Emergency responders documented copious amounts of bloody vomit, a lot of it. And Ryder was resuscitated after multiple rounds of epinephrine and transported first to Skagit Valley Hospital and then transferred to Seattle Children's Hospital for advanced care. His hospital assessments documented aspiration pneumonia, hypovolemia, which is a loss of liquid, meaning critically low blood volume, and severe dehydration. Laboratory findings showed extreme hemoconcentration with hematocrit measured at approximately 56.4%, along with highly concentrated urine. These findings are consistent with prolonged, inadequate fluid intake, so extreme dehydration. Even worse, medical staff suctioned dark fluid and blood from Ryder's feeding tube. Imaging studies confirmed aspirations in both lungs, which are all indicators that his body was under extreme physiological stress. Ryder suffered a diffuse anoxic brain injury, which is damage caused by prolonged lack of oxygen, with no neurological reflexes. So after several days on life support and with no indication of neurological recovery, Ryder was compassionately extubated after Russell agreed to remove his life-saving care. On December 21st, 2025, Ryder Belisle passed away in hospice care, and the documented cause of death was cardiac arrest of uncertain origin, likely due to aspiration and dehydration. And Tachi, the mother, was called only after Ryder was extubated.
Less than a month after the courts were warned this exact thing would happen, the child was found blue in cardiac arrest with bloody vomit, severe dehydration, aspiration in both lungs, and lab results showing his body had been under prolonged physiological stress. And we're supposed to believe that this is just tragic timing? And then his mother, the person who kept him alive for 12 years, doesn't even get a call until after life support is removed. It's infuriating. This wasn't unpredictable. This is exactly what people begged the courts to prevent.
Right. And I don't know if the courts saw Tachi as an overprotective mother or someone with some kind of vendetta, but I can't even try to understand how this was allowed to happen despite her repeated attempts to stop it. As the details of Ryder's final weeks became public, advocates, disability rights organizations, and members of the child welfare community described the case as a profound institutional failure. Across social media and public commentary, some supporters characterized the outcome as judicial homicide, arguing that the custody orders that were enforced against explicit medical advice placed Ryder in lethal danger. Judges and authorities were repeatedly warned that removing Ryder from his mother's care carried a serious risk of exactly what happened. So, yeah. For Tachi, she was the person who had kept Ryder alive and stable for years by coordinating his care, managing his medical needs, and responding to emergencies. She sought relief through the legal system and repeatedly raised concerns about Ryder's safety, and what she got out of it was an unimaginable loss. So there were difficult questions about how family courts handle medically fragile children, how much deference is given to medical directives, and what safeguards exist when courts are warned that an order could be fatal. Advocates wanted to know who would be held accountable when a child died after authorities were warned of the exact risk that claimed that child's life. So on January 19th of 2026, Ryder's mother posted a public statement outlining what she described as the factual and legal foundation of her role as a parent prior to enforcement actions. In her statement, Tachi wrote that she was the custodial parent under the Washington Parenting Plan. She stated that she had sole decision-making authority for non-emergency medical care and for education and school enrollment.
This made her both the medical and educational proxy for her children. Tachi further stated that under Washington law, when a custodial parent with sole decision-making authority plans to relocate, permission isn't required, only notice.
She wrote that she had complied with the statutory requirements by filing a notice of intent to relocate and providing identifying contact information for the Ohio residents, which she noted was wheelchair accessible. She also stated that Ryder's medical care continued without interruption and that school planning and enrollment for the children were ongoing. Tachi further emphasized that, based on her understanding of the court record, no order had removed her custodial status or decision-making authority prior to the enforcement actions that followed. She closed by stressing that this distinction is essential to understanding what happened.
How is this even a legal process? Imagine what would have happened to a woman who had no public involvement, or the documentation that she had. I just can't understand it. It's just wrong.
And it only gets worse. So as the information about Ryder's final months began to surface, it was horrifying. According to accounts from family sources, Ryder, a medically fragile, non-mobile child, was reportedly sleeping in a recliner rather than a hospital bed, and did not have consistent access to specialized equipment and environment required to manage his condition safely.
For a child with chronic aspiration risk and respiratory issues, positioning and equipment aren't optional. Tachi would have known that.
And medical records later indicated that Ryder had a documented milk allergy and required specialized amino acid-based formula delivered through his feeding tube. After Ryder's return to Washington, concerns were raised that he was instead being given a formula that contains milk-diverted ingredients, not to mention that the fact that Ryder was recorded as having severe dehydration when he was admitted to the hospital for the final time. And just another content warning here. So the emergency records, they also described what happened the morning Ryder was found. According to the documentation, Ryder was put into his bed wearing his BiPAP breathing mask, and it was described as a normal night the night before. And by morning, he was unresponsive and cyanotic, with vomit present in his airways. As we know, medical imaging and assessments later confirmed aspiration, material entering the lungs, which is a known and documented risk for children with Ryder's diagnosis. And this can happen particularly with poor positioning, suctioning, and without close monitoring. So it's clear that concerns about Ryder's care environment, feeding management, and hydration that were raised were all aspects that led to his collapse. And after the court order, Ryder transferred into his father's custody. Communication between them basically disappeared. According to statements from Tachi and accounts cited by advocates, Russell did not consistently respond to requests for information about Ryder's condition or location. Tachi later stated that she was unable to obtain timely updates or confirmation of Ryder's whereabouts during this period.
As these details became more public, some supporters and advocates began using the phrase custody but not care to describe what they viewed as a disconnect between legal custody and day-to-day medical responsibility. So I don't really know how this decision by the court was made to hand Ryder over.
After Ryder's death in December, Tachi updated the GoFundMe she had originally launched months earlier, while Ryder was still alive and while she was actively fighting through the courts. And in this updated listing, Tachi described herself as a full-time mother of 3 and as Ryder's lifelong caregiver. She wrote that after 12 years, Ryder depended on her for everything. She was his nurse, advocate, medical coordinator, and voice. In the update, Tachi explained that there were ongoing legal proceedings that directly affected her children's safety and stability, the integrity of Ryder's medical and legal record, and accountability surrounding decisions that impacted his care. She wrote that grief does not pause the legal system, and that court deadlines do not stop because a parent is burying a child. And she detailed her financial reality. She lives paycheck to paycheck, relies on inconsistent social media income, does not receive child support, and has already sold belongings to cut expenses. But she still cannot afford the thousands of dollars required up front for legal representation. Without an attorney, she risks losing the ability to protect her daughters, defend Ryder's legacy, and navigate the legal system on her own. Donations are intended specifically for legal counsel, court filings, and records, protecting her daughter's future and preserving Ryder's story with accuracy and dignity. She closed it by stating that Ryder mattered, his life mattered, and his care mattered, and that she would not allow his story to be erased, minimized, or rewritten.
According to many, the judges that granted the removal of Ryder from his stable and reliable medical care are already convicted in the court of public opinion of arrogance, incompetence, and dereliction of duty. And Russell reportedly stands condemned as well for fighting to take his disabled son, and according to public opinion, neglecting him to death.
And public opinion has also talked about how this case raises disturbing questions about how family courts handle medically fragile children and what happens when procedure overrides medical realities. Advocates have pointed out that if repeated, explicit life and death warnings fail to prompt intervention in a case as visible and well-documented as this one, it raises concerns about how the system will respond when parents without resources, public platforms, or legal support raise similar concerns. Members of the disability community and child welfare advocates want formal investigations and institutional review. Some have publicly urged disciplinary action or broader accountability measures, arguing that anything less would fail to address what they view as a profound breakdown in safeguards for medically fragile children.
Ryder's case implicates federal civil rights protections under the Americans with Disabilities Act, specifically Title II. According to that, a child suffering from a degenerative neurological disease qualifies as a protective individual under the Act, which means he would have been entitled to reasonable accommodations and protections that must be grounded in professional medical judgment.
Right. Title II applies to state and local government entities, including courts. And under federal law, decisions affecting disabled individuals are not supposed to disregard expert medical guidance when that guidance directly relates to safety and access to care. Ryder's condition, it placed him squarely within the category of individuals the ADA was designed to protect, and decisions impacting his care environment should have deferred to documented medical expertise rather than proceeding solely on procedural grounds.
Federal civil rights law is intended to act as a safeguard in exactly these circumstances, when standard processes risk producing outcomes that place disabled individuals in harm's way. That's why advocates say that Ryder's case may ultimately reach beyond family court altogether.
Additional commentary raised constitutional concerns about how federal law interacts with state court decisions in cases involving disabled children, specifically the Supremacy Clause of Article 6 of the United States Constitution, which establishes that federal law takes precedence over conflicting state actions. Again, referring to the rulings by the U.S. Supreme Court that emphasized deference to qualified medical expertise in cases involving disabled accommodations. Under the Americans with Disabilities Act and related federal case law, state courts act under parens paritri authority, meaning they have an independent duty to protect the welfare of minor children, particularly when life-threatening risks are identified. Once explicit medical warnings were submitted, the court's role shifted from resolving a custody dispute to ensuring protection of a medically fragile child.
No matter what, it's clear that Ryder's case is a huge example of what can happen when the right safeguards aren't in place for anyone who is medically fragile. All of this commentary makes it clear that somebody needs to be held accountable.
And Ryder's story isn't over. Since this happened, his mother has continued to speak out, not just to preserve her son's legacy, but to protect her daughters and push for accountability in a system that failed her when it mattered most. There is also an active online community where updates, court documents, and advocacy efforts related to this case are being shared. That group is Justice for Ryder Belisle on Facebook. It's a space where supporters are tracking developments, asking questions, and making sure Ryder's story is not forgotten.
And if you want to hear directly from Ryder's mom, Tachi is also active on social media, where she continues to share updates and document what this fight looks like for her. You can find her using Tachi Lynn, TACILYNN.
We want to thank you so much for listening and staying with us through this difficult case and for helping us shine a light on stories that demand attention like Ryder's. If you would like to support the show so we can continue covering stories like this, you can follow Crime Salad, leave us a positive review, or share this episode with someone who needs to hear it. Ryder mattered, his life mattered, and his story deserves to be told. If you would like to support the show in other ways, you can check out our Patreon for ad-free listens and also our merch store. We've got tees, hoodies, stickers, and more. And every purchase helps us make this show. Thank you so much. We will see you next time.